Hi everyone, welcome to our first decolonisation discussion in collaboration with Uncomfortable Oxford. So we at the ISIS, we'd seen that Uncomfortable Oxford had released a new podcast series called A Very Brief Introduction to the British Empire. So we thought it'd be a great opportunity to have a casual discussion about the themes in the podcast and just about decolonisation in general. This event is on the first module of the series, The Age of Exploration, and we hope to hold a second event like this on their next module, A New Imperialism. It's always helpful if you've listened to the podcast beforehand, just to kind of know what they're talking about, but also it doesn't matter if you haven't listened to them. And we want to have as much of the audience participation as possible. So please comment any questions or discussion points below in the comments and we'll read them out as well. So from the ISIS, we have the lovely Asma Waheed and Jedlovszky, who will be leading it from our side. And then on Uncomfortable Oxford side, we've got Paula Larkinson, Olivia Durand and Phillips. So without much further ado, I'll pass over to Uncomfortable Oxford, who will introduce themselves and the podcast a little bit more. Enjoy.
Hi everyone, my name is Paula Larkinson. I'm co-director of Uncomfortable Oxford, and I'm also currently a doctoral student at the University of Oxford studying the history of medicine. You can probably tell from my accent that I'm Canadian, so I do research the history of Canada and North America generally, and most of my research focuses on the history of immigrant and Indigenous populations to North America itself.
Hello, my name is Olivia Durand. I'm a final year DPhil in Global and Imperial History and the co-director of Uncomfortable Oxford. From my own accent, you can hear that I'm French. And my own research is on the creation of modern continental empires in the 19th century, with a special focus on the United States and the growth of the Russian Empire and the use of settlement policies to expand.
And my name is Phillips. I'm a final year DPhil student in history. Global and Imperial history is what I'm doing, and my research focuses on the Pacific region, and specifically I'm interested in the ways in which Australia and New Zealand have thought about and engaged with the Pacific region from the 19th through to the 20th century. And despite appearances, I'm not in the Pacific at the moment, I'm in London.
Okay, great. I'm just going to launch into some questions now. Firstly, I wanted to ask, how is it that you guys were able to come together, and how did you find each other to make the podcasts, and what was the inspiration behind making the Uncomfortable Oxford podcasts? I'll direct this question to Paula.
Yeah, so our itself, Uncomfortable Oxford is a social enterprise we put together, Olivia and I, starting in 2018. And mostly what we do is walking tours. But we also really realized during our walking tours how little information there is about the British Empire that's just easily accessible. It's not really included in curriculum in the UK. And we wanted to create some sort of public education initiative as well. And so we started launching a public lecture series last November. And we invited doctoral students who research these subjects from the university to come give a public lecture on a very basic or a very brief introduction to the British Empire. And then in March, we went into lockdown. So we decided we would turn those lectures into podcasts, and that's even better. It was already a long-term goal to record them and disseminate them as far as possible. This just allows it to happen a little bit faster for us.
And speaking of lectures, do you see any hope that in the future colonial history would be taught in schools in a bit of a more unbiased and more fair way? To direct this question to Olivia.
I mean, we have lots of hope for that. To what extent it will actually happen in a short term is unclear. But what we also wanted to do with those podcasts is to really create some sort of online resources that anyone could use. Someone could just go on a walk and listen to this podcast, but also teachers could use it as a resource. They're not aimed at specialist audiences. They're supposed to be easily understandable. And with Paula and with other members of Uncomfortable Oxford, prior to the lockdown, we also had been working on different programs. We wanted to maybe try to run in some local schools in Oxford, different workshops about geography, about understanding space and history a bit differently. But well, now we're still working on it, but we were not fully sure what's going to happen because it was definitely more of a kind of hands-on sort of intervention rather than an online thing.
Okay, great. I just wanted to ask about the podcast series. It's mentioned quite often that these European explorers are quite efficiently able to sort of colonize all these different areas. What are the major factors that enable them to do so? I'll direct this to Sean, so we'll take turns.
Very, very, very tricky first question, and hopefully Paul and Olivia and the rest of our guests will be able to flesh this out a little bit. It's very tricky. Well, first of all, I think we would all want to eschew this idea of European exceptionalism or the narrative of triumphalism. But at the same time, there are certain factors that I think are quite significant in the ability or the method of expansionism. Just as a couple of examples, and then I'm sure Paul and Olivia will add to this, but for example, in terms of maritime history, the types of shipping techniques used, so literally the types of boats that were able to sustain much longer distance travel. One, which obviously is not a unique thing to European culture. I mean, we know, for example, that Austronesian cultures were already doing these interoceanic journeys thousands of years before Europeans, for example. But in terms of the expansion of knowledge and the actual technology itself, there's a vast increase in this long distance traveling coming from West Eurasia, particularly from the European powers we associate with imperialism. And something else as well, maybe to consider, is that there are certain institutions that are quite significant in terms of the development of a maritime industry and an expansionist industry. For example, in Britain, Lloyd's is hugely significant in establishing insurance, literally being able to insure these long distance journeys by European merchants, particularly British merchants in this case. And this is very, very important because one of the things I think we often think about in terms of European expansionism is that it's initially state-led, and there's no doubt that the state is very heavily involved in these, but there's also a very, very significant private enterprise. So it's really embedded in the broader history and development of capitalism, as we know as well. So there's just a couple of points maybe that Paul and Olivia can jump off.
I feel like I just wanted to slightly plug one podcast we've done before the module on the Age of Exploration, which is a standalone podcast on disease and empire. So it was, instead of the public lecture we're supposed to have in April, we decided that we're only reading about diseases anyway, and they really wanted to talk about it, but also wanted to keep talking about empire. So we did this one podcast trying to show how diseases and epidemics sometimes helped European and British colonization, how it sometimes hindered this colonization when Europeans were dying very quickly, especially in tropical spaces that had yellow fever and malaria, but how, on the other hand, European diseases such as smallpox did decimate vast amounts of native populations, especially in the Americas. And maybe Paula could say a bit more about that because she's actually in the history of medicine. So
yeah, so if you listen to that first podcast, it does really do a good discussion about how the spread of disease really decimated populations across North America, South America, and everywhere really that they were spread. But it also shouldn't be overemphasized as the only reason why individuals were able to have like successful occupation in North America from Europe. I think, and this is, again, Olivia and I are switching topics here. One thing that often is not talked about is how settler colonialism makes a big difference too, when you put people on land and they stay there and have generations of people on land that are staying there. It allows for a slow process over many years to take place where individuals are supplanted, put into a place and say, this is now my land, I have occupation of it. And Europeans in history worked within a framework of a kind of assumed international law about what it meant to be an effective occupier, and they would recognize rights to other Europeans to land if they had followed these international conceptions of what it meant to have rights to lands. But the one thing that is overlooked is that when it came to European expansionism, the only rights to lands that they recognized were, of course, were other European nations. So the assumption that land was there for taking, that places are there for taking, that trade is there for taking is intrinsic to all of these, and is recognized by the conflicting and competing powers of Europe. And so having those many different powers, not just Britain there, meant that there was this impetus to continue going. And as Sean mentioned, individuals going for capitalist reasons are searching for more places to trade with and more places to gain resources at, and then also more land to gain as well. So all these forces are really interlocked, and it's not just one that makes all the difference. And there's definitely no such thing is, as Sean said, is European exceptionalism. It's that they intertwine and they led to continuation over long periods of time that allowed for effective colonization.
Just jumping back to Sean with this question, but why do you think there are so many like conflicting theories, especially in pop history and geography, about why Europeans were extremely successful in the colonization process?
I think it's probably just important to say at the outset that in terms of our discipline of global history, this question of this notion of the West and the rest, or why it is that the West arose, so to speak, to use some of the terminology that historians of the past have talked about, is one of the really challenging, enduring questions in the historiography. Just to quickly comment so people can maybe dive in a little bit more to the debate if they're really interested in this. A really significant book published by a historian called Kenneth Pomerantz in the late 90s called The Great Divergence looked at some of these factors and why it was that Western Europe and the Yangtze Delta region of China, which had what he saw as being comparative standards of living, comparative wages, comparative systems of nutrition, things like this, why it was ultimately that it was the West was able to, well, why there was the situation like Treaty Port China that emerges within decades of this seeming parity. And one of the things is that there are, on certain factors, there is a degree of technological superiority, vastly overplayed in a lot of the literature, but it is quite significant, particularly in terms of the technology of war. But then there are all these other factors that Olivia was just talking about in terms of epidemiology, which are hugely significant in terms of particularly in my region in the Pacific, the demographic catastrophe of the arrival of Europeans is hugely significant in the changing circumstances of that region, for example. So I think one reason why historiographically there's so many conflicting views is because there are so many conflicting factors. Almost in every place, the factors that change the situation are different, and also because it sort of feeds into this sort of broader debates and kind of culture wars. It almost enables and allows people that want to tell this triumphalist narrative of Western civ on the one hand, on the one extreme, and then on the other, I suppose the antithesis of this. So that's the reason why you have such divergent views on the question.
I just want to jump in really quickly too on that one. And so there's this need in history, as well as many academic disciplines, to always try and reduce something to a single cause. It's just an aspect of the way discipline has developed, and that we're always arguing our cause is more correct and your cause is more correct. And historians are put in these academic conflicts where we have discussions saying, well, this was more important than this. And it's a very reductionist narrative. And ultimately, it's never one cause. But the fact we have conflicting theories is because academics make their careers off of conflicting theories.
And just to also jump in at the end of this question, I think very often there's also this tendency to look at one empire at a time, and that's maybe what we're doing in this podcast series. But it's really impossible to think of the British Empire and its expansion without thinking about the other empires, European or not, that were waging war, taking lands, trading in the region. So just to give like one example, because I did the lecture or the podcast on the Indian Ocean, in the colonization of India itself is a very complex process. India didn't exist as one geopolitical unit until actually it became a British colony. But the colonization itself took a lot of time, and there was a major polity in the north of India called the Mughal Empire. But one reason why Britain managed to overtake this very powerful empire was because the Mughal Empire itself was fighting Persia at the time and was extremely weakened by its fight with Persia. So Britain didn't take over the space because the Mughal Empire was weak. It was because it had been weakened by another very powerful empire, which itself kind of frazzled down because it had its own internal conflicts.
Okay, great, thank you. I just wanted to just jump back on the topic of disease. So in the podcast series, it's explained quite well that the reason why the sort of Native American people, why the population number decreased so significantly was because the disease would arrive in one area and then people would run away from the disease and then they'd spread it. But how significant was the sort of disease that the native people would give to the settlers, in the sense that did it really affect the settler communities that much when they had first arrived? I'll direct it to Paula.
Okay, sorry, I assumed it was coming to me, but I did want to jump in. So this is a complicated question, because when we look at disease today, I mean, we're all feeling the effects of it with currently COVID-19, and you can see how scary an epidemic can be, and the fear that is intrinsic to those feelings of watching individuals you care about pass away and die in very sudden, unexpected ways. But there's also something that's not visible with today's epidemic, and that's time. And with the initial spread of smallpox through North America, which happens, that is very devastating in the early years, only mostly to the indigenous people. But as time goes on, the disease itself becomes more infectious and more likely to infect European settlers as well. So smallpox itself just being the example in this case. The smallpox that comes over with Europeans, it does not have the same type of infection patterns as later, once it's become part of the endemic effects of Europe or of North American disease culture. So you see a change in the epidemiology of it, in that it's then goes on to reinfect a lot of the colonizers as well. And that's just the disease form itself changing over time. Even with COVID-19 today, we have regional variation amongst different geographic locations. It's minimal, it won't affect something like the disease makeup, but it does make a difference, specifically because diseases themselves change through time. And so as time goes on, smallpox does devastate a number of European settlements across North America as well, but it doesn't have the same initial devastation that happened during the first wave of it across North America. And then if you're referring to, I did mention syphilis specifically in that podcast, and syphilis is a different type of disease in that it doesn't have a sudden onset, and 14 days later, if you had a bad version of it, you die. It's not that type of disease. Syphilis is a long-term tertiary stage, goes through these different horrific stages. And so it's not the same type of infection epidemiology. It doesn't do a quick hit and then go. It's not like a big epidemic of syphilis, but it does therefore impact a lot more people on scale generally, as it is able to stick around with one person for a long period of time, and every person they have the ability to pass it on to. So you can see it spread over a longer period of time to very large regions of the world because of the European spread that syphilis came from the New World to Europe and then was spread out from there. So it's different type of infection cycles. And I think that every kind of wave itself needs to be seen in its own context. I mean, the differences between epidemics over time are quite significant. And it's hard to generalize as much as we try for that. So the initial wave killed a number of people, but then you have this recurring interchange between disease and infection.
So all of the diseases we were talking about are kind of one of the big examples of damage European countries have done to the other countries that they colonized. And so this is kind of a much larger question, which I'm now directing to Olivia. But I'm just curious of your opinion on what do you think if countries should, the countries that colonize the others should pay reparations for the damage they have done to the other countries?
That's a very good question, because it's also kind of problematizes what do we mean by reparation. So you use the verb pay, but is it financial money? Is it international aid? And a few weeks ago, we did do a podcast with the Society for International Development, questioning what is international development really, and how does it highlight how decolonization as a process didn't really finish. And I guess in terms of reparation is maybe the fact of recognizing that a lot of countries that have been colonized are still relying on institutions and structures that were put in place by the British Empire, the French Empire, Spanish, Portuguese, and so on. So on their health services, on the whatever road they built. And it's very hard to move away from that, because they also inherit the flows of the structures, because those structures were being built in a colonial setting. So they are not necessarily the ones in which the most money and most care was invested. But when we talk about education, when we talk about the museums, when we talk about health or general public services in countries that have been decolonized, I guess whatever reparation could be would be in the acknowledgement that they're still relying on those structures, and how could we maybe move forward to better it. But I'm a historian. I look more at the past, although I read a lot of news about the present, but I'm not necessarily the one to ask for policies specifically.
Yeah, no, I was kind of just curious of your opinion. How do you see this? But then would you think that certain policies, even if you don't really know what policies they are specifically, they would be like a better way of repaying than just like money?
Well, repaying, I think, it's
direct.
I mean, when you think about like wars, at the end of a war, there's a treaty and often there's a reparation for damage. There was a whole centenary of the First World War that ended just like right before the pandemic. And one of the big things at the end of the First World War was the amount of reparation that Germany had to pay, and the kind of series of consequences that triggered as well. And I guess the absence of reparation does show that there's not a recognition of the violence that happened during colonization and during decolonization as well, because decolonization in most places was an extremely violent process. And shying away from a discussion on reparations is actually not acknowledging this violence and the fact that it's still impacting the life of many people who went through both colonization and decolonization, but also their children, and it'll probably impact them for many more generations.
I just want to jump in on that as well. I'm sorry if you had another thing prepped as a response, but the concept of reparations and financial payment is difficult because in many ways it can be framed as almost an abdication of responsibility. You can throw a bunch of money at something and say, oh, great, we pay back what we did. And like European nations gain a lot of financial benefit in many different forms through colonization, and that money and the wealth that many European nations and Western nations have today come from colonization itself. And throwing a bunch of money and saying, this is how much we owe you is really, really reductionary in how you think about ways of which some sort of reconciliation can happen after this and some sort of decolonization process itself. And it can't be throwing money and saying, good, our obligation is over. And it can't be throwing money and not saying, saying, here's your terms for how you're supposed to spend it, because that's very much the parental mindset that has always been there. And honestly, the only best way to do this is through very contextualized, individual, collaborative solutions, which utilize the strengths of the countries as they're and the directions of countries that have been colonized, and the peoples that are going through the changing process, what they would want to see. And it has to have some sort of mutual discussion there. It's really complicated though, and I don't think it can be done en masse ever for any situation. It always has to be taken within a very specific discussion that utilizes multiple nations, multiple peoples within those nations, and recognizes that even as a concept of nationhood, that's a very modern concept. Many Indigenous populations, for instance, the First Nations across Canada, we have over 300 First Nations. And so each one of those have their own unique impact and experience of colonization itself.
Okay, great. Still on the topic of paying reparations and paying back what's due, do you think perhaps we should start using the original indigenous names of the colonized countries or places? Or does that sort of erase the colonial history? Or is it that maybe we should start using these names because it shows that these countries are more than their colonial history? I'll direct that to Sean.
Sure. So maybe just to talk a little bit about this, I could use an example from the Pacific, and some examples of how this is being done. So, for example, in New Zealand in the last few years, there's definitely been a push to, at the very least, have a bilingual. So now we don't just talk of New Zealand, we talk of Aotearoa as well, the name that the Maoris use for their homeland too. And there's been a really interesting debate emerged in the past few years around the Cook Islands. So the Cook Islands, named after Captain Cook, but there's been a big debate led by a man called Danny Mataroa to come up with effectively a new name for the Cook Islands. And it's quite an interesting debate because in terms of some of the challenges ultimately that are having to be brought together. So first of all, there's a recognition of a Maori heritage ultimately and a Pacific heritage. But then at the same time, there's also a big debate that there also should be a Christian element. So you have this mingling together of a pre-colonial and a not post-colonial, but a colonial element coming together. But on the general point, there's definitely a movement in this direction. There are, I mean, Atir, for example, is the name change that is currently the one that is the most popular of over 117 that were predicted. And I think that things are moving in this direction, that at the very least there's going to be 2 names utilized for a period of time, but people will get used to and will use the recognized name that best fits. And there's many cases of this in the Pacific I can talk about. There's the one of the Cook Islands is quite interesting, for example, and that's something that looks like it's going to happen, and I would support that.
And can I just jump in before we move away from reparations and ask, do you think if the colonizing nation pays reparations, that then again reinforces this relationship of the superior and the inferior country, that they kind of, the colonized therefore need the support of the colonizers, if that makes sense? I'll ask Paula because I saw you reacting.
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually, it is really tough because it always paints nations in terms of wealth. And again, like, this is really problematic to do. There is a lot of value, a lot of wealth, and a lot of cultural, especially, I want to say cultural prominence in all nations, but colonizations are not just their histories of colonization. You know, they have people within it that have long, very, very important histories that are very valuable and are not in any way less wealthy in that kind of form. And I do think to paint conversations all around finance really is very much back to this capitalist idea that Sean was talking about earlier. Colonization was based on capitalism, and now if we say reparations is based on capitalism as well, we're going to be in the same concepts before. Like, it needs to be always contextualized. It needs to be seen as I don't even want to say trade. I want to say like an interchange of some form, and it needs to be always. Finance should never be the number one. It should be conversations about how different cultures can help and bring a lot of different types of wealth to a setting that is mutually collaborative. So it's really tough.
I just want to, oh, sorry, Olivia.
Sorry, I just wanted to build on what Paula just said. And also, and the question you just asked about how it could maybe reinforce the power of the former colonial state on the former colonies. I mean, most of them, if you look at Britain or France, I mean, they already have financial investments in most of their former colonies. They'll have industry there, they'll have factories. There's already like a lot of money going through. So I think there might be this risk of reinforcing a sort of a purely economic relationship, and then also ignoring some of the other lingering effects, which are probably like one of the biggest one would be language. And I know we want to talk a little bit more about language and literature later on, but it's the fact that the absence of recognition of native languages is one big thing. And again, another form of reparation, which is not just financial, might be changing the curriculum in the country. That was the colonizing country initially, in actually having a more global and encompassing history of what happened, and stop to pretend that this is the history of France or the UK as a nation state, even though the idea of nation state, whenever France and Britain or the UK become a sort of nation state, it is already within a kind of framework of empire.
Do you think that, for example, giving back the artifacts that are now usually on display in English, French museums, that would be some sort of a more adequate form of reparation, even though it's also financially or institutionally not much, but recognition-wise and having like establishing more equal states, would that be a bit more beneficial? I would direct it to Olivia back.
So we've been working with museums in Oxford for our activities as well, with the Ashmolean, for instance, and we had started with the Pitt Rivers, but the pandemic kind of cut our efforts short, unfortunately. And the discussion of returning objects, returning art to the countries where they have been taken from, whether they were colonies or whether it was during a conflict, or even if you think about the archaeological sites in the Middle East, in Greece, and in which context of power relationship those objects ended up being in Western Europe rather than in their original, like near the archaeological site. And it's a very complicated conversation to have, but also it's very complicated in practice, because each museum might have a different position on this, but they're not fully, they cannot decide for alone what they're going to do, and the state also cannot decide for all the museums. So there is a very complex legal framework that already makes the conversation, like the conversation has to happen with each individual museum at a time, and even more so about each individual item at a time. So I think the conversation about reparation or return of the objects is a very important one. But one thing that the Petrovius has been doing, and that was very, I think is one step forward, is that they've been actively collaborating with communities from where the objects were taken. So there was, it was in February, I think, they brought a representative of the Maasai community, and they asked them to tell their own stories about the objects that were the Maasai objects that are in the collections of the Petrovius Museum, how they are actually used, and what is the personal link surrounding those objects, because when we see them in the museum, they are completely separated from any personal story. And most of the objects, some objects are, I mean, it's actually really rare historically that an object is just made to be put in a case to show to people. And most objects are linked to individuals and people and stories, and that's something that we often forget. So to kind of complexify this debate about repatriating object, there's also the other debate about understanding the object are as linked to individuals in the past and in the present as well.
I just also want to jump in on the concept of returns or repatriation. This is difficult because when you decide to return an item, or if an item has been claimed to be like of a controversial origin, it's still up to the museums in the West and the academics in the West to decide. And this is really problematic because, for instance, there's a case of Kennewick Man in North America. The regulations in North America say that under NAGPRA, which is a Native Americans Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, human remains must be repatriated. And Indigenous peoples are often the skeletons that were held across North American institutions. But it was not until almost like 2013, I think it was, that DNA analysis could say this is the group that this Indigenous person comes from. So we'll return those remains to this group, because burials are so important to the spiritual journey of an individual, that for many Native American communities, the return of people to their tribes was really important. But which tribe do you return it to if you found it on this location? Because that location has changed hands so many times, and dating itself is quite difficult to find. So the origins itself were always in controversy, and there are many Native American communities, in the case of Kennewick Man, that claimed to have this individual as their ancestor and wanted him back. And then it was up to the Western North American academics to decide who was correct, like whose claim is correct on this. And even then, they were claiming that they didn't. Some of them were saying, "Well, he's Polynesian actually, so he doesn't exist under NAGPRA because he doesn't come from North America, so we can still keep him." So there's this really, really difficult complication here in how you have arguments between academics, and how academics are always the privileged voice as well when it comes to these arguments. And who do you return those Maasai artifacts to, for instance? Because again, you can't generalize an entire tribal group as even just one. And so the origins of things are always quite unclear when it comes to how they were stolen or taken. And you have to decide. The museum's always the ones who decide, okay, well, we believe this story, it probably came from this person in this situation over that person's story. And those are really another layer of complication to add in.
Okay, great. I just wanted to ask, this is jumping back to the sort of historical side rather than in the present day. With the podcasts, I was wondering the sort of thing came up where it was like some colonies became trade colonies and others became settler colonies. What sort of factors do the two need to have in order for them to become a trade or a settler colony? I'll direct it to Sean.
Okay, it's another tricky question, and again, I hope Olivia and Paula will be able to interject and add to all the things that I miss. There's quite a few different factors. One of the things that's very significant is the notion of a place being empty, there not being a recognizable, knowable, at least in a Eurocentric sense, settlement, for example. So the claim of terra nullius can be made, for example, is very, very important. There's a climactic dimension, this sense that European peoples can only settle and live in what was called the temperate zone, and that tropical spaces weren't places where a European civilization could thrive or be settled. That's something else that was taken very, very, very seriously, even until almost the mid 20th century, and that had a significant impact upon settlement. And then probably one other factor that I would just raise is that there's a really contested but a very, very, very important essay written many, many, many years ago called The Imperialism of Free Trade, and the argument postulates that in the British case that it was always the minimum political function that imperial powers sought to exert in order to maintain authority. So you have lots of examples, for example, where if it was the case that they could engage in the type of relationship, this might be the extraction of resources, this might be a strategic post, if that could be established without long-term present settlement, then that is what would be done, for example. And this partly is quite useful in explaining why there's such a plurality and variety of imperial formations, relationships across the world, not just in the British context, but in all the different colonial contexts that we're looking at. We could challenge that thesis and the notion of it, but I think it helps to give a sense of the plurality of different situations locally that we're trying to deal with.
Just to jump back onto contextualizing decolonization a bit, decolonization literature is quite a big concept, and regarding that, I want to ask, does the term like decolonization literature actually limit our engagement and appreciation of the works due to the weight of their historical context, or are there like thematic expectation that would come with the genre? Any limitations? Paula, what do you think?
I'm always kind of wary of the term decolonization. It literally means to undo colonization. And I would argue that's basically impossible to do. You can't undo colonization. History has happened, it's colonized, and we need to deal with the ramifications of that. And part of the ramifications of that is recognizing how much contribution individuals who come from an Indigenous background, who would be considered to be the colonized, how much of an impact they've had on every country's development. I mean, England itself is currently going through lots of conversations about whether or not, what's truly English or what's British. The Windrush generation being not considered to be part of the British settlement, or at least British identity in the same way, and yet it's incredibly British. And so these conversations about what it means to go back before colonization is quite difficult. You're right, it does have a lot of weight of history to it, and it can kind of be limiting. It's also going to make individuals be victims quite often as well, and victimization is a difficult thing to force upon a whole people constantly, always, and it's far more beneficial and rewarding, I would say, to have complexity in multiple dimensions, not just before and after, not just oppressors and victims, but to see individuals within a legacy of everything, colonialism, of globalization, of wars and conflict, and modernization as people who are living in the worlds that we currently all existing in. And see them in all of that, and not to just say this person is a writer who comes from who's from like an oppressed background, and therefore it's decolonization to read their stuff. Instead, to say this is an excellent writer, let's have them spread across all of our courses. We should have writers from every background spread across and not just reduced to something like, oh, it's the women's section, oh, it's the Indigenous writers section, oh, it's the Black History Month, oh, it's Queer History Month. Those are quite simplistic terms to handle, and the idea of going to undo colonization itself is really, I would say, it's impossible to do, undo colonization.
I mean, personally, my understanding was that the term that was maybe more used in circles at the moment is post-colonial literature, which is maybe more helpful. I mean, it's another tricky piece of terminology to unpick, but maybe doesn't have some of the same problems with decolonisation. I suppose I'm sort of throwing the question back there and asking whether that's maybe a more useful term, but it seems to be one more broadly as a genre of literature that maybe fits better. And it's certainly the one that in the Pacific context is the one that is the preferred term, and it's sort of allowed this sense of rewriting of particular types of travel narratives, of island stories, things like this. So it has been quite significant in that regard, although we can of course debate whether post-colonialism is a problematic term too.
Yeah, and I would just also jump in and thinking that I don't appreciate any novel without its historical background, maybe because I'm a historian, and that was something I was always being scolded for when I had to write an essay in literature. It was like, you're talking about history, not talking about the book. But I think all literature has to be appreciated both for its literary value and its historical context. You cannot, they don't go without each other, whether it is whether it is the literature from formerly colonized country, what is called word literature, and which is also an interesting category. The word, when are we in the word? Is it like the former empire? Is it any country of the word? I feel like it changes again a lot according to who you talk to. But I think it is important that we apply the same sort of approach to post-colonial literature that we apply to any work of literature, which is we appreciate their literary value, but we also appreciate the book in the context in which it was produced, because it would never have been produced without that context.
Okay, great. On the topic of literature, there's quite a good question, which is, in order to gain global recognition in the contemporary literary world, writers are inclined to write in Eurocentric languages such as English or French, which is seen with Asma, who is an Algerian writer who writes in French in order to express her pain. So the question is, can the mentality and experience of a non-Eurocentric writer ever be accurately represented through the language of their colonizers? I'll direct that to Paula. Then anyone else can jump in.
Can the language or can the mentality and experience of non-Eurocentric writers ever be represented through the language of their colonizers? So this question, I would say, assumes that language is a static thing. And I much like culture, language is something that changes with time. The language of English that we speak today is not the same as language of English that was spoken 300 years ago. And I would argue that there's been a lot of significant contributions to English that come from many different individuals worldwide that are maybe just so frequently they're unrecognized in modern language. For instance, the term caucus is from an Algonquin term. So when we have a caucus, it's actually coming from indigenous language in North America. And even a lot of our food terms like tomato and potato, those are South American indigenous terms. So a lot of the things that we think are English today actually are quite mixed. And it'd be quite, I think, do it injustice to the cultures that contribute lots to the language. And I think that to assume that language itself is only a product of what the language itself is not the same as 300 years ago. And I haven't read this French author that was written here, the Algerian writer who writes in French, but I think that the French that she writes in probably expresses a pain of colonization because it's gone through the process itself. The language itself has, even the French that's spoken in French Canada is very different from the French that's spoken in French in France. And in other colonies too, there's a lot of difference in French, and same with English too, that we have these regional variations. And so I wouldn't want to reduce anything down to assuming that language itself is fixed, is unchanging, and is fully dominated by the individuals that claim it as their language today. This is another thing too. It's English itself. I would say it's just not English anymore. It's not, and it's really egotistical for us to say it is. It has even English itself came from the original French domination of the English Isles through the Norman conquest. It's a mix of Latin-based languages with Germanic, because the Normans conquered during 1066, and then it went on, and it's I wouldn't say that to claim it's just egotistical of us. It's a shared language, and it does have elements of domination and power, and it has elements of subversion and rebellious aspects too.
Yeah, and also I want to jump in that as well, because I agree with you totally, Paula, in that, like, as a French student, I studied Aimé Césaire, who's a Martinician writer, so of a colonized place. And although he uses French, the French he uses isn't familiar to French speakers. So you read it and you kind of have that feeling of a jarring effect when you read it. And I think that kind of recreates this feeling of distance from being a colonized land and the colonizers. And even if it is French, it's not because, like, he's using it in his own personal way as a Martinician person. So I feel like it's not necessarily like static, like you said. But yeah, I just wanted to jump in with that.
I think that speaks to something that's sometimes called the Creolization of languages. What happens when a language, a European language generally, evolves within a colonial context. So you have that very much in the Caribbean, but in French we use the word Creole for any sort of French that is mixed with native languages. And I think, again, I haven't read the Algerian writer, although I've read other authors from, for instance, Lebanon or from Vietnam, which were both countries that had been colonized by the French, who wrote literature in French. And I think there is something to say also about having a bilingual experience, and how what it does to the self and what it does to the experiences of the writer. And if they have experienced something within a certain language, even though they have two or more languages, it can also choosing one language over the other might also enable I don't know, showing or sorry, I'm losing my English. In a way, it might allow to highlight different things that come from their own bilingual experience. And I'm myself bilingual, but my bilingualism is a choice. Being bilingual because of a colonial situation is even more significant, and has a much deeper impact probably on the creativity and the artistic expression of different authors.
I just want to say Oxford, actually at Pembroke College, I think it was, had a visitor last year, Marlon James, who wrote A Brief History of Seven Killings. And that book is an incredible discussion of the use of English language in lots of ways, because he's a Jamaican author, does a great job of utilizing different types of English to speak through the experiences of different individuals in the attempted assassination of Bob Marley. And it shows just how, I guess, how much we assume there's only one type of English or French even, or any language, and yet it's not true.
Just to jump back onto Emmaleig's point on Césaire in the curriculum, it's kind of a general thing that the university subjects like literature feature predominantly, sorry, my English is also not working today, but predominantly white and Eurocentric male figures. And when they recognize this problem or someone raises the problem, they kind of try and solve it with the tokenization of colonial or diverse voices. And I kind of just want to ask, how can that step be avoided, or what steps can universities take to actually like overcome the representations across the subjects while kind of avoiding this tokenization, which is a bit degrading in my opinion? I would direct it to Sean.
Yes, it's tricky because we do get the sense that just shuffling the reading list around a little bit seems to be the approach, and it's clearly not enough. I mean, there are lots of different answers to this question. I think more variety generally in the reading list is a start. I think that is important. I don't think we should belittle it entirely. I think hiring practice is important, having a more diverse staff. I think where possible, trying to engage in projects or to have writings that are in other languages or translated and taking them seriously as being texts that we should use. And I think this is certainly something that is debated more and more within global history. I think they're both very, very important. And one other thing as well is for, particularly, this is just in historians working in the faculty, that is for us to be proactive and to really be creative in thinking and taking a lead when it comes to module design. Because one of the things that's quite tricky is that you have this sense that you're bequeathed a syllabus and a framing around the topic, and you're sort of trying to shoehorn as I said, this is partly the reason why I think you end up with this tokenism that you're talking about that you abhor, is because you have this structure and then you're just trying to find ways of bringing in different voices, where actually probably more fundamentally there needs to be more of a rethinking of the framing, the terminology, etc., etc., etc. There's a really interesting debate around this by some really, really great women that teach history in universities in the north of England, Sheffield, York, and Leeds in particular, in the History Workshop Journal. I think the roundtable discussion is actually called Decolonising the Curriculum, but it's a really, really useful framing of the challenges that they have had in terms of thinking these questions through and how they're each responding to this. And that's specifically in the teaching of history.
I'm going to also say that as far as academics go, one of the main problems is that most of them also tend to come from the background of being, you know, all white and male. Maybe that's not always the case for new hires these days, but one thing that's common is people who inherit a structure, but also they tend to have been taught in those ones, and people are lazy and they don't bother looking for something that would be different from what they know. And we're not really as all of us are PhD students, we have like set reading lists that we're supposed to follow that our supervisors give us, but if you stick with what you know, that's what's going to end up on the syllabus in lots of ways too. So it's probably a little bit more on academics and individuals within universities to take those steps and to find post-colonial literature and to rethink the structures, as Sean said, that they've inherited, and say, well, this isn't just me to follow, but maybe to change and see what my students say as well. The student voice is very important there.
And maybe also starting earlier than university, so also doing it in the curriculum of secondary schools, because if we only start doing it at university, we'll only touch a very limited amount of people who are very lucky to be able to do university studies, but it means that it still shows for the majority of people that there is literature, and then there is other word literature, or like there are writers and there are female writers of color and so on, which they're all writers, and this is all literature, and maybe that should be pushed forward a lot earlier, because to some extent children or teenagers would probably accept that, and it would already kind of change the frameworks of thought and the kind of the structures for which we think literature, for which we think history. But then that's a very big project, and not fully sure how it could happen, but I would very much love to be part of it, both here but also in France, because we are encountering the very same issues in other countries.
On that note as well, oh, sorry. On that note,
I did want to say we didn't really address specifically the concept of tokenism, and I wanted to bring that up because this is something at Uncomfortable Oxford, what we do quite often is we get told that when we talk about histories of colonization, we're talking about someone else's history, you know, that it's a history relevant only to people from a different country. Or we talk about women's history, well, that's women's history, as Olivia said. But what is missing from this conversation is that these histories are everyone's histories, and when we separate them into these token, this person's and that person's, you by necessity say, well, they're for those people. Whereas the history of colonization is not just for the colonized, it's the history for the colonizers as well. And it's everybody's history, and everybody needs to learn it. They shouldn't just be able to say, oh, you know, when I walk into a garden, I don't want to learn about where all these names for different plants came from, because gardens should be, you know, an English garden is full of plants from the colonies. So you should learn about that history of colonization when you walk into an English garden. There's a lot of different aspects of that are left out when it comes to tokenization and assuming that it's somebody else's history.
Also with that, I, for some reason, which is quite surprising to other people, I learned about the partition and about like the sort of race for Africa at school. But one thing that comes out of that is sort of hard to manage, and that would be a problem, I think, when teaching it in secondary schools, like nationally, would be to sort of erase that sort of idea that the railways are good for India, therefore colonialism is like, okay. That thing really grinds my gears because it sort of erases all of the violence, like we had mentioned before, all the violence that comes with colonization and the generational violence as well that sticks around because of it. So yeah.
Yeah. In case anyone wants to jump in on that, feel free. But otherwise, I think this is kind of our last point. Did anyone want to say anything on that before we end?
I just wanted to answer to the railway comment, being like a lot of things that end up being a good or a positive, have a positive impact, did so as a sort of coincidence or an accident. They weren't necessarily meant for it. This is not why railways were built in India or in other places. It wasn't to help the native population. It wasn't the positive impact as an accident, and kind of celebrating that accident doesn't excuse the rest of the history.
And also the positive impact of railways are only positive because the populations of India found a way to make them positive. They were built for British trade and British resources, and then people in India made them useful. So it also doesn't recognize that it's not the British who brought something in and gave it to people in India. It's saying, actually, this is something that the British came in, built for themselves. Later we're not able to have control of them, and the people who lived there made them useful. So that is very much also never recognizes the indigenous agency at all within those conversations, and then uses it as an excuse for the fact that many people died while building those originally, from not just from India, but also from the other colonies that were imported as slave labor and as servants to individuals there too. So it's very, you're right in saying it's very one-sided.
Okay, so I think we're going to end there because it is 8 o'clock. But I think as well, because with the secondary school curriculum question, just doing things like this, having the podcast, having discussions about it is a step forward a little bit, even if we can't do nationwide change. It's always good to have these things. So thank you so much for kind of coming and doing this evening. I've really enjoyed it. And thank you so much to Krisztina and Asma from ISIS and you guys from Uncomfortable Oxford. And hopefully we can do another one for your next module as well. And I'm sure we still have some questions that aren't necessarily related to the module that we still want to speak about. So thank you once again to everyone. I hope everyone watching has enjoyed this evening. And until next time, if you want to say anything to end, feel free. Otherwise, we'll probably end here.
Thanks for having us. We appreciated being on here. And we hope more people listen to the podcast if they're interested in hearing these histories.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, we're looking forward to the next conversation.